Uh, Good morning, everybody. So I'm going to finish off the lesson that we started yesterday, the birth of the Weimar Republic. So I just need to, the drill. I just need to sort of whiz through the slideshow to the point that we actually reached. So just bear with me while I go through the slides. Or good opportunity for you just to quickly sort of recap your memory as I do this. Okay, so there's the point that we reached. We've covered three of the strands. We looked at the January 1919 elections and pointed out that it was dominated by a sort of coalition of three moderate political parties, the SPD, DDP and ZP. And Hebert was in effect therefore appointed by that majority as the first president of the Republic, with Scheidemann as the head of government, the Chancellor. Okay. We then talked about the right-wing reaction, and that term reactionary, which is a key point. And the two parties on the right, the DVP and the DNVP, that sort of rallied in a sense behind the stab in the back myth, basically rejecting the Republic as illegal. Then we've got Hebert's first days and the sort of first things he did as the new president. As I say, he appointed a head of government, Scheidemann, and he tasked a Jewish liberal lawyer, Hugo Preuss, with drawing up a constitution. Okay, so we're now going to sort of get into, in this sort of second half of the lesson, the sort of major problems that Hebert and Scheidemann had to grapple now as the new leaders of the new Germany. And I say, I think it's important to have in your mind that at that point in time in January 1919, having suppressed the Spartacist uprising, there was a genuine popular support for the new republic, a willingness to make it work. Remember, 75% of the German voters, in other words, 3/4 of Germans, had backed those three ruling parties, the SPD, the DDP and the ZP. Okay, so there was a reactionary rejection of the Republic by the far right, but those two far right parties between them at that point in January 1919 didn't command many of the votes. But kind of sneak preview, that situation didn't last long. The first 6 months of the Weimar Republic proved to be a complete disaster for Hebert and Scheidemann, and by the summer of 1919, and this is what we're going to be looking at now, there was a significant shift of that popular support away from the ruling parties, those three parties in the middle. And that popular support, much of it shifted to the far right and also the far left, what we call polarisation. Anyway, let's go into it. So what were the major problems? Now, the first major problem was economic. Okay, massive problems for the new government of the Republic to sort out. So millions of returning German soldiers had been reintegrated into German society, but that, and although that sounds good on the surface, the war's ended, they're coming home, there was a massive unemployment problem. Okay, creating jobs was a massive problem. The British blockade actually continued into 1919. Remember, there hasn't been a peace treaty yet. It's just a ceasefire, basically. And until there's a formal ending of the war, that blockade continued. So although the war has ended, the food shortages continued. And when you've got shortages of anything, the price of things go up because people are prepared to pay more for things if there's a shortage. So therefore, there was a problem of inflation, price rises. Okay, so wages couldn't keep up with the cost of goods. So that's the first economic problem. Then there was another one, and that was the fact that the German government was heavily in debt. Now, if a government is spending more than income it is receiving, then we call that a balance of payments problem, okay, or a deficit, as it's sometimes called, okay, but basically a balance of payments problem. Now, there had been a balance of payments problem even before World War I broke out in 1914. It was actually a continuous problem, and bear in mind section C of the paper, you have to talk about 120 years of how Germany's economy evolved in one of those two questions, so bear that in mind. But one of the constant problems ever since 1871 was indebtedness. In other words, the German government having to borrow money from various sources to implement its policies. So what basically happened is that the war compounded the problem, okay? So there was already a balance of payments problem. It got worse during World War I. And that's because Germany fought the war, as you know, on the assumption that when the war ended, they would have huge swathes of territory. So remember Siegfrieden, okay, the policy of that the Hindenburg and Ludendorff pursued as the silent dictators, that when we win the war, we will literally annex, remember that word, annex, huge swathes of territory in the east that will become part of Germany. And of course, if you take extra territory, you will take the wealth of that territory, and basically that's what we would call a sort of plunder approach. If you plunder, you're basically robbing, you're stealing land as a war policy. So the German government was confident that with a plunder policy, that when the war ended, they would get all this extra territory and they would use that extra wealth to repay her creditors. Creditors are people who have lent money to the German government. But Germany lost the war. And even worse than that, Germany lost territory. Okay, and as a result, that meant that Germany was not able to repay her creditors. So the situation was, by 1919, the German government was massively in debt. Okay, so all of those sorts of problems mounted up. Okay, so let's again just pause. I don't think there's sort of like need for me to say much more. You can pause the video now and do a little bit of mind mapping, and then just press play and we'll push straight on. The only bit of new information on that page which you need to get into your notes is that the method that Germany used during the war, the government intervened in the economy by printing money. Okay, now that's not necessarily going to solve the problem. It might solve the problem in the short term if you print more money, but basically that just devalues the money. If there's too much of something, it becomes less valuable, and actually in the long term that made the problem even worse. But it was a short-term solution. And the other one was selling war bonds. Okay, so individuals, organisations, German people basically could purchase war bonds. They're basically like IOU notes. It was sort of like sold as a sign of patriotism. You're a good loyal German if you sort of buy a war bond from the government. So basically it was a quick short-stop way for the German government to get extra money by selling these bits of paper to the German government. and the deal was after 10 years, the government will pay back the money that we have, will pay that back plus interest. So they managed to raise 10 billion worth of marks to pay for the war by selling these bonds to the German people. But of course, the problem doesn't go away. It's an IOU note. It basically means they've made a promise to pay it back at a later stage, plus lots of interest. So that again has sort of increased the indebtedness. Okay. So there we go. That's the economic problems. Now, the next strand, which is the Treaty of Versailles. Notice the date, 28th of June 1919. So in other words, about what would it be, about 7 months since the end of World War One. It took that long before there was a peace treaty that formally signed off the end of World War One. The point as is made there is you are expected to know this from your GCSE notes. Okay, so in my YouTube channel, in the playlists, in the 1914 to 1919 Germany playlist, you will find a couple of videos made for GCSE. They're nice short little videos that just basically take you through the Treaty of Versailles. So if you need a little bit of recap on the key things, then just play those. But in a nutshell, what are the key things you need to know? So on the 28th of June 1919, which was 8 months after the war had ended, the new German government was presented with the Treaty of Versailles. Okay, Versailles is a place in Paris, France. Okay, so France, as one of the winning countries, basically summoned the representatives of the German government. So Hebert, he actually sent Matthias Erzberger and Walter Rathenau, two names who've come across in the past, as his representatives. He sent them to Paris, and there was no discussion. It was simply a massive shock. The terms of the treaty were basically dictated to the German, and Erzberger and Rathenau basically had to go back, having signed it, and say to the German people, I'm afraid we've had to sign this really, really tough treaty. And it was a massive shock to the German people because the terms were much, much harsher than they had been led to expect. Now, there's all sorts of debate on that, of course. Put back into your mind just briefly how just earlier in that year, a year and a bit earlier, in the spring of 1918, when Germany was winning the war in the east against Russia, Germany didn't hesitate in imposing a really, really harsh peace treaty on Russia, that grabbed lots of territory from Russia. So, yeah, the argument is that Germany was now getting her comeuppance in the West, and part of the terms, the deal of the peace treaties at the end of the war now is that Germany, any land she had taken from Russia, now had to be given, actually not back to Russia, but towards the creation of these new countries. We'll come on to that in a second. So at first the German government refused to sign it, but then the Allies basically squeezed, they applied pressure. Remember, the blockade was continuing. They threatened to relaunch the war, to invade Germany. Remember, the war ended before any foreign soldier has set foot on German soil. So the Germans don't want the war to restart again because Germany was in full retreat. So they had no choice. Now, those reactionary German politicians on the far right, who have basically made a deal, you take the power, so you can basically handle the fallout of the war, are now thinking, well, I'm glad we did that, okay, because for now it is further proof of the stab in the back myth, okay. So all they did is repeat their accusations that the political leaders who have now formed the new government, they were the traitors who had basically inflicted unnecessary defeat, and that Germany would have won the war, etc., and that the armistice of November 1918 was a huge betrayal of these sort of like soldiers on the front line who were winning the war. Put aside the fact that actually they were in full retreat, but that was conveniently shoveled under the carpet. Okay, so the stab in the back myth was pure denial, but nevertheless, sometimes perception is reality, and it certainly was there. Now the politicians on the far right are sort of like started repeating all these arguments, and of course, the people in Germany now were listening to them. Okay, so many of the supporters on the people who had voted for the Aber and the moderate parties in the centre in January 1919 now suddenly started to listen to the reactionary right wing, and they began to shift their loyalty and their votes. Okay, so the myth of the November criminals was born, and that's the nickname that was now given by the far right to people like Aber and Scheidemann and the people, the parties who are now running Germany, who've now had to sign the terms of the Treaty of Versailles. So the reactionary right wing used those terms to describe the leaders of the new republic. Okay, so there you go. There's a couple of links. If you download the PowerPoint, there are links on the PowerPoint. 10 minutes just gives you the terms of the treaty, and 13 minutes just talks about the reasons why Germany resented. They're GCSE videos, okay? But if you don't feel you're secure in your knowledge, just have a quick play of those. They were recorded 6 years ago, much younger version of me. Now, what's you've got to get your head round is the maps, okay? Because there were fundamental territorial changes. There's the map of Europe in 1914. As you can see in the middle, there, it was actually a fairly simple map. There were three major empires: Germany, Russia, and Austria-Hungary. Now, of course, the term empire means that there were lots of different ethnic groups living within each of those countries. Okay, so you can't see a country called Poland because the Polish people, some of them lived in Germany, some of them lived in Russia. Okay, Austria-Hungary was a real mishmash of lots of different what we call national groupings, the people who spoke their own language and had their own identities: Czechs, Slovaks, etc., Croatians, etc., etc. Okay, many in Austria-Hungary, and likewise Russia had national minorities. Now, one of the sort of the main deals that Germany now had to confront when she was invited to Paris was that the map, and the US President Wilson was very much of a driving force behind this, was that so I just pulled back a little bit, and was that the Europe before 1914, the reasons that the war had broken out in 1914 is because of these different tensions that existed, because the Poles wanted to have their own Poland, and etc., and particularly down in this corner of Europe, what we call the sort of Slav nationalism, sort of Bosnian Serbs, etc. Won't get into that sort of detail, but those sorts of tensions had caused the war. And so now at the end of the war, the part of the reasons behind the peace treaties was sort of like we need to have a reckoning here and fix the map of Europe so that we deal with these tensions. And one of the big issues then was that effectively new countries were created. That was the decision. And as you can see, now the Poles are being given their own country between Germany and Russia. Okay. Czechoslovakia, Austria-Hungary was literally broken up into, as you can see, Austria as a separate country, Hungary as a separate country. A new country called Czechoslovakia was carved mainly out of Austria-Hungary, but some of the Czechoslovakian land was actually taken from Germany. So Germany lost some land to Czechoslovakia. It was called the Sudetenland. Okay. And most interestingly, Germany as Brown, well, look what the creation of Poland actually drove a little wedge of land through the middle of Germany. So Germany lost land to Poland, but in doing that, basically a piece of Germany was literally separated off by what we call the Polish corridor. And that separate piece of Germany was called East Prussia. So it's still Germany, but it is now physically separated. Okay. Other new countries, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, were created out of the old Russia, and Yugoslavia was created in part mainly out of the old Austria-Hungary, but it encompassed the old Serbia, and for example. Okay, so the map of Europe was redrawn. Now the argument it was that was basically good because necessary, because it gave the various Polish nationalists and the Czech nationalists, etc., what they wanted, which was to have their own country. But how do you draw boundaries around people? Because the boundaries are going to be blurred, and that was very, very evident with that Polish corridor. Because within that Polish corridor, there were German-speaking people. Within Czechoslovakia, around the edge, particularly this sort of area here, sort of just if I can just quickly get my pen working, this sort of area here, okay, I'm just shading in. That was a real mixture, and there were a lot of German-speaking people who lived in Germany who suddenly found themselves living in a new country, Czechoslovakia. And as I say, look, quite a few German people in that region there, the Polish corridor, where you have mixed populations. So that was a real cause of tension. So the map here sort of shows those sort of major issues, how Germany was physically split in two and the new countries. So just pause the video and have a little look at that. Make sure you're comfortable with that. And then the terms of the Treaty of Versailles itself, as I say, I'm not going to take you through them, but as I say, here in the east, the black area, that's the sort of like land that was lost to the new Poland, and it gives you all the detail, etc. But Germany had to pay reparations eventually, and we'll do more on that. Okay, in the east, Alsace-Lorraine in black there was physically given back to France. An area called the Saarland, which is the diagonal lines there, was put under international control until 1935, and it was then said, because that was a mixture of French and German speaking people, and it was decided that in 1935 there would be a vote to decide, and the people in that area could decide which country their bit of land would belong to. Would it belong to France or would it belong to Germany? And the Rhineland area, which contained Germany's most rich industrial territory, the Ruhr was part of the Rhineland, is shaded green there. Well, that wasn't lost, it stayed as part of Germany, but it was demilitarized. Germany was not allowed to maintain a military presence in the Rhineland, so it became a demilitarized zone. And add to that, there was various provision that the French could maintain an occupying force in part of the Rhineland as well for a number of years. So you can read all about that separately. And you don't really need to know that much detail. Schleswig-Holstein, basically the north went to Denmark, but the south voted to remain Germany. So it was a tough deal. In terms of impact on the economy. Now, bear in mind what was said earlier about the huge economic problems, then suddenly in 6 months later, the Treaty of Versailles had a huge impact because much of Germany's industry was in Alsace-Lorraine. She lost a lot of her richest industry now it went to Poland. Plus she had to pay reparations, she had to pay war damages, and that was, as you said, the amount was set in 1921. So these existing economic problems that were even there before World War I, that were made worse during World War I, now, 8 months after the end of the war, have got even worse again. Okay, so that's where we are with that. There's another map there that just shows the key terms. So just spend a little bit of time looking at the map. They're on the slideshow, and the detail is really interesting as well. But I think, yeah, you can sort of see the key terms. There's the reparations that was set in 1921. There's the information there with the arrow about the Rhineland, and there all these territorial changes in the east. There's the Polish corridor shaded there, etc., etc. So nice little map that. I use that at GCSE. And there's the information that I've just sort of like summarised. So you can pause the video and just have a quick read through that. But we've covered most of the point there. And the question 1, 2, 3, the prompts, I just pointed at the relevant text. There's that word that was used at the time. It was called a dictated piece, and the German word for dictated is diktat. So that was a sort of common word that was used at the time by the reactionary right. And of course, the really, really most famous article in the treaty was that humiliated Germany more than anyone else, and that really fueled the far right with their stab in the back myth was the famous Article 231. Okay, and that kind of hung the whole treaty together. Everything else stemmed out of that, because Germany was forced to accept guilt for causing the war in the first place, and it was a much more complicated thing than that. Germany basically could not accept the fact she caused the war, and there is a counter argument, and this has been discussed over 100 years by historians, but there is a counter argument that the war was a result more of circumstance than one particular country being the main driving force. And certainly at the time, and over the next 10 years, even the British came round to recognise the fact that actually it was incredibly harsh to say that Germany caused World War I to happen. But nevertheless, in 1919, Treaty of Versailles, Germany was forced to accept war guilt. And of course, by accepting war guilt, that justified all the other points in the terms of the Treaty of Versailles. You can't punish unless there is an acceptance of guilt. So Germany saw it as an unfair punishment. So there we go, that's the Treaty of Versailles. One more strand then, well, two more strands, but they're kind of like linked, the strengths and the weaknesses, and then we're finished. So let's just quickly have a look at that. So strengths v weaknesses, and I say it's a question of just balancing it. It's now a question of pulling back and thinking about, right, what was it like? You know, what can we say about this new Germany that was created in 1919? And clearly, there's a lot of problems now, okay, with this new Germany, but equally there are some significant strengths, and we as historians have got to be able to see that. Okay, now part of the problem we have as historians is, of course, we now, with hindsight, we look back and we can see that the Weimar Republic ultimately failed. It only lasted 14 years. Okay, it basically collapsed, it fell apart. Well, the real beginning of it falling apart, in a sense, came in 1929. There was the Great Depression, hit the whole world. Germany, the Weimar Republic, really struggled with the impact of the Great Depression. We move into the early 1930s, and a series of weak governments couldn't handle the Great Depression, the problems imposed on Germany, and ultimately the far right, the reactionary right wing that we've talked about, found a spokesperson for their cause. He was called Adolf Hitler. He led a political group on the far right called the Nazis, the NSDAP, and Hitler became Chancellor in January 1933. And within 6 months, by the summer of 1933, Hitler had dismantled the Weimar Republic. He had found loopholes in the constitution, and he basically dismantled the democratic system, and he created a dictatorship, and he declared the Weimar Republic to be dead. And Germany then entered 12 years of darkness, basically, in which Germany became the Third Reich, the Third Empire, led by Adolf Hitler. So we've got that hindsight that the Weimar Republic did not survive. But we've got to be ever so careful with hindsight, because knowing that it failed, we can therefore maybe only see the weaknesses of the Weimar Republic. And there were obviously weaknesses in 1919. But it did last 14 years, and there were some enormous strengths, okay, that we need to recognise. At the time, particularly in the mid-1920s, it appeared as if it was going to survive, and a lot of great stuff came out of the Weimar Republic. So just need to sort of sum up strengths versus weaknesses. So in spite of the criticisms of the far right, the new republic had considerable strengths, okay, which we need to sort of recognise there. It was built on very, very solid democratic foundations. Okay, we've already mentioned an equal vote for all men and women over the age of 21. And we'll do more on that next lesson when we look at the constitution that Hugo Preuss wrote. Okay, it had ended the war. the unification of 1871 was maintained. Okay, I know Germany lost land by the Treaty of Versailles, but the Treaty of Versailles could have been harsher. For example, the French, if they had got their way, and the British and in particular the Americans said, whoa, 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 to the French, you can't do that. But the French at the Paris Peace Conference, in those long discussions for 8 months, they wanted to break Germany into smaller countries, okay? Basically, as she had been before 1871. Okay, so it wasn't a given that the unification of 1871 was going to even continue, but it did, and they decided they wanted to keep Germany as a single country. So those are the strengths, but there were definitely considerable weaknesses. Now, the Aber-Gröner Pact, really cannot emphasize that strongly enough, was a huge weakness because, as you know, that particular deal that was struck at the very beginning, that phone call, had basically said the old elites, the sort of junkers and the industrialists, those elites who were basically the foundation of the Second Empire, the Kaiser's men, would continue in their very, very powerful positions in the army, the civil service, the law, legal system, judiciary, and the education system. But many of those people in the old elites were the reactionaries, okay, that we've already talked about. They supported the reactionary parties, so who despised the Republic. And yet the jobs they held, the army, the civil service, judiciary and education system, is part of the machinery, what we call the establishment, whose job it is to support the system and to make it work. So these poor politicians at the top, people like Hebert and Scheidemann, they had got the job of passing laws and making decisions and then handing those decisions over to the civil service and the judges and the education system to implement, but the people in the top jobs in those systems, whose job it was to implement the decisions of the government, despised the system. Okay, so we can now say, looking back with hindsight, that that's a pretty tough call for the new governments of the Weimar Republic to sort of like have to manage the machinery of government that should work for the government was biased against it. Then you've got these roving bands of sort of voluntary soldiers that we've talked about, the Freikorps, who their violence had been challenged against the communists. That was had successfully put down the threat from the left, but they likewise despised the Republic and they wanted to overthrow the Republic. And although now officially disbanded because the threat from the Spartacists has been crushed, many of them basically chose to support the reactionary parties on the right. And there were new reactionary parties, in particular the Nazis, who we'll talk about more. And they were sort of like the main focus for many of these Freikorps who joined radical right-wing groups such as the Nazis, who were absolutely committed to doing what they could to overthrow the Republic and to sort of restore a authoritarian system such as existed before 1919. And then we've got those huge economic problems that we've talked about. And of course, now there's a big shift. Now, ordinary Germans who had voted for those three moderate political parties in January 1919, as I said at the beginning, they suddenly, effectively, within 6 or 7 months, began to change their mind. Because the Treaty of Versailles had was a huge reason for that, because the stab in the back myth that had been there ever since November 1919 suddenly became very, very, very understandable when the German people heard about the Treaty of Versailles. And so many of the ordinary Germans who had voted for the SPD and the DDP and the ZP in January 1919 decided to switch their allegiance, and some of them went to the far right, the reactionary parties. Others actually went to the far left, to the Communist Party, and we'll look at that more. Okay, so as a result, that 75% of popular support for the Weimar Republic that we saw in January significantly fell down, significantly shifted downwards. So that's that in a nutshell. So again, there's a sort of summary of the strengths and the weaknesses. Point 1 is a list of the strengths. Point 2 is a list of the challenges, and I think we've covered most of those. Again, you can pause the video and just read through those. And there's that point. The pro-Republican parties were never again going to achieve the heights of the 76% vote that they received in January. And we'll look at lots of graphs to show how the vote shifted to the polls, as we call it, polarization. Okay, so those are the key questions. Give 3 strengths of the New Republic. Can you present a counter argument to say why the New Republic was weak? Sorry, it's the same. It's the same slide. I've duplicated it by mistake. And there's the final mind map for today's lesson finished off. So a reminder that in the lesson tomorrow, Friday, we'll then take a look at Hugo Preuss and the Weimar Constitution, and again we'll pick up the threads of strengths versus weaknesses by looking at the Weimar Constitution. So if you can do the flip learning, have a quick look through the textbook before the lesson tomorrow with that in mind. That's it. Thanks very much. I'll sign off now. Bye.